for joining us today. I am Sharina Kudi, General Manager for Delta Airlines Southern Africa. I assure you that the next 90 minutes or so will be incredibly interesting and informative. COVID shook the world and changed life as we knew it. Just like many industries, the aviation industry and the way we travel has changed. These changes have allowed airlines, including Delta, the opportunity to do self-improvements, review and implement new strategies, reducing our cost base, and to do things that were not possible to accomplish just a few months ago. Together with leading experts, Delta has collaborated and developed partnerships with leading industry experts, such as the Mayo Clinic and Lysol. And as a result of these collaborations, we are proud to present the industry-leading Delta Care Standard, a superior standard of care for safer travel. Delta Care Standard comprises of 4 pillars of care: cleanliness, more space, safer service and care, and flexibility. Cleanliness refers to implementing a set of enhanced policies and practices to provide cleaner air, cleaner space, and cleaner surfaces. More space involves the blocking of the middle seat into at least January 2021, limiting capacity to more space on board and promoting safe distancing in the airport. Safer service and care includes the prerequisite that all customers and employees wear masks and providing care kits to our clients and adjusting our service to reduce touch points. In addition, Delta is one of the first Fortune 100 companies to embark on testing our entire workforce, as we view testing a critical step in protecting the health and safety of our employees and customers. Finally, flexibility. A favorable ticket change policy combined with the elimination of many fees ensures that our customers can book their travel with confidence and peace of mind in these uncertain times. Leading the charge with our enhanced initiatives, Delta continues to pioneer in the aviation industry and a leader in ensuring the health and safety of our customers and employees. To talk on the very relevant subject this morning, navigating the post-COVID South Africa, political and economic challenges, I'd like to introduce our special guest speaker, Daniel Silke. Daniel is one of South Africa's leading political economy analysts, futurists, and keynote speakers. His success lies in blending both political and economic trends. Daniel served in the Western Cape Provincial Parliament and City Council as Portfolio Committee Chair for Economic Development. He also speaks globally at major conferences and the World Affairs Council in Washington, D.C. on African issues. He regularly visits the US, traveling on Delta, of course, and is a global political trend and risk consultant for GLG in New York, as well as on the Duke Corporate Education Panel of Speakers. He has appeared on news channels and the author of the book Tracking the Future, Top Trends That Will Shape South Africa and the World, and writes columns for Fin24, News24, and Business Day Online. I am eager to hear what Daniel has to say, and so I will hand over to him. But before I do, we would love to hear from you. So please feel free to use the interactive chat on our Q&A platform, which will be moderated by our specialists, the Century City Virtual Conference team. They will consolidate all questions and pass them on to Daniel for him to answer at the end. So, without further ado, I will hand you over to Daniel.
Good morning, Delta, and what a pleasure it is for me to be here with you this morning. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you. It's one of my favorite industries, I must tell you, and I've always had a soft spot for the aviation industry combined with tourism as well. So it's a delight for me to have been asked to appear and to give you my 2 cents worth as to where we are at, a little bit about the world, international global trends in terms of this sort of COVID and into post-COVID post-COVID economy, and then, of course, dealing with South Africa and whether we indeed have a chance at regression or revival. And obviously the word is going to be revival, hopefully for all of us. So, sit back and relax. I hope you've got some questions for me. I like to have penetrating questions that I can answer, not that I can't answer, and I look forward to getting those at the end of the presentation. Let me just begin by saying that I've had far too many health checks over the course of the last few months or so, and like many in South Africa, and like many of you no doubt watching, the biggest issue to improve my health will be the ability to travel and to get back on a plane and to cross international borders. I do hope that's coming, and I do hope it's coming relatively soon, and we'll come back to some of those issues in a moment, because I think obviously there are some aspects of your business that in a sense coincide with some of the big global trends that I like to look at as well. I also want to particularly commend Delta on the launch and relaunch of the services suspended prior to COVID. But obviously, as a Cape Townian and coming to you from Cape Town, I'm delighted that the plans to include Cape Town on your direct route into the United States are really coming to fruition. And believe me, you will certainly have me as one of your regular passengers out of Cape Town in particular. So well done to everybody at Delta for that initiative. And again, putting Cape Town on that global map as well as part of your route network. Now, let me begin by taking you back to New Year's Eve, December the 31st, 2019. I remember where I was. I happened to have been in Southeast Asia at the time, I must tell you, and I was at a party celebrating like no doubt many of you were as well. Little did you know what was going to happen over the next 9 months or so. And that's sort of the traditional poster, I suppose, of New Year's Eve 2020, it could be 2019. Just to be a little bit naughty, just for a moment with you, perhaps for many of you, this is really the revised logo of 2020. It's what it's become for many, and in particular, in the travel and tourism business, you were sort of first in terms of suffering regulations and probably last out in many countries across the world. It's been particularly damaging and indeed horrendous from a management point of view. And I was interested, just to go back quickly and have a look at this particular chart, which I put on the screen for you, because it just shows you how unprepared even the best of minds were in dealing with what was to come. Every year, as you know, the World Economic Forum hosts a gathering in Davos in Switzerland where they analyze and try to identify the top risks to the world in the coming year. If you have a look at that particular chart, you will see that all of the top risks for 2020 are in some way related to climate change, extreme weather, climate action failure, natural disasters. Now, yes, we've had a lot of natural disasters this year, hurricanes, to put it mildly, in the United States and other natural disasters, but nowhere in that top list of 5 risks do you see anything about a health pandemic. And this is from the world's biggest, perhaps most influential think tank. So, if they didn't see it coming, none of us could see it coming, and we have all obviously had to face the consequences. And when you go back, and you look at the last 9 months, and you look at the images from around the world, and if I'd been doing a presentation a year ago, and I would have shown these images, airbrushed images for that matter, photoshopped images, you would have thought, this guy, what's he on? What kind of science fiction stuff is he watching? A restaurant in Maryland in the United States, separating its clients by making them sit in a large tube, social distancing. We didn't know the term 9 months ago. A park in New York City where those enjoying the outdoors had to sit socially distanced in demarcated areas. I mean, images we would never have thought of only a year ago or so. The Hajj in Mecca, only domestic pilgrims for that matter, socially distanced. It's a marvelous image, I might add, just to again show you the global depth and spread of how we have tried to handle this particular pandemic. And of course, only recently in the last month or so, the US election nomination contests where Joe Biden, the challenger, of course, to Trump, accepted his nomination not from a crowd in a huge venue, but from his family and friends on what looks like some sort of Zoom or virtual screen. Remarkable images that simply show the changes that we have adapted to over the last 9 months or so, and no doubt we'll have to live through for some time. Now, I don't want to belittle the airline industry at all, but here's another amazing change. I mean, just look at this chart of how our business environment has also shifted so dramatically. The market capitalization of a company like Zoom, which all of us are using, now is bigger than most of these major airlines in terms of market cap put together. So there are important shifts in business, certainly, and of course shifts for investors as well, as a result of this pandemic, and probably will remain with us for some time to come. Now, we in South Africa, of course, are often very critical of our own domestic leaders, but certainly the pandemic has caught everyone off guard, and it certainly caught these two on screen off guard as well. No matter how much either of them will tell you that they did the best that they can, very few global leaders will really be able to claim absolute success in dealing with what has been an unscripted, unprecedented event. And when you look around the world from an economic perspective, you can just see the dramatic effect on the GDP growth rates across the world. All those countries shaded in red on the screen really do represent GDP shrinkage of anywhere between 3, 4, up to 8% or more. And obviously you can see South Africa there at the bottom of the screen. We'll come back to South Africa when we talk about that in a moment or two. So very few countries, with the exception, as you can see, perhaps of China, and significantly so, have escaped the worst of this pandemic. And again, let's just drill quickly into some of those global figures just to see that, we are not alone in South Africa. I'll come back to that, of course, again later. But you can just see everybody suffering very dramatic GDP contractions. Spain and Italy affected in the extreme form by very high case numbers there at the bottom of the screen, clearly affecting their economies. But the Southeast Asian countries in particular, and China, you can see when you look at those biggest global economies in the world, China, the only one to show continued positive growth over the course of this year. South Korea did well in managing their particular crisis, also limited negative effect, but certainly for most of the rest of them, the effects of COVID are going to last and last for some time to come. And I just thought I'd also put this chart in, which is quite interesting, and you can go and have a look at it, or I'll give it to you, or ask me for it, which shows you, it's from The Economist, and it just shows you the expected recovery time for countries to claw back their GDP to where it was prior to COVID. And it's quite interesting because, again, you can see that, China there on the top left of the screen, China looks as though it's going to claw back that bit quicker. But for most of the other countries of the world, you are looking at some clawback in 2021, the majority 2022, the weaker economies 2023, South Africa there only by the end of 2024 can we expect perhaps to get back to where we were prior to COVID itself. And the same would go for many other damaged economies. Argentina, Italy, Mexico for that matter, are going to take some time to recover from this particular pandemic. But having said that, there is a recovery. And there is a recovery in certain of the key markets across the world. And it is important to point that out because hopefully now, it looks like from a global perspective, going through a moderate second wave in many parts of the world. We have still seen the opening up of economies, the relaxation of regulation and restriction, and as a result, what will be precipitous drops this year, likely to also see an improvement going into the 2021 period, at least for the United States, for the UK, and broadly speaking, for the Eurozone as well. So the world is hoping for a relatively fast recovery. We've all been discussing what letters of the alphabet should we use to describe this recovery. Is it a V shape down and very sharp back up to where we were? Is it some sort of strange W shape where it goes down and up and down and up? Or is it the sort of swoosh shape that I put up on the screen. And for the moment, it looks for many economies around the world as though we are in some sort of swoosh-shaped recovery. A sharp decline, a relatively sharp or certainly limited improvement from the worst of the economic effects of the pandemic, and then a kind of sort of a mediocre trend upwards for some time, but still below what we were at globally prior to the pandemic. And I think this applies to many economies across the world. It's more like a swoosh rather than a classic V recovery. For many industries across the world, they've been disrupted. The oil price clearly has been disrupted quite heavily. Both demand and supply issues have affected the oil price. Going forward, I would expect a more stable oil price at these levels, between $40 and $50 per barrel, as the global economy begins a slow but meaningful recovery into the next year or two or so. In the United States, we do see an improvement in consumer spending. It's interesting, if you have a look at this particular chart here, you can just see how consumer spending bounced in the online sphere in the last 6 months or so, and of course declined quite significantly in the physical or in-store experience. That trend probably has exacerbated this shift from retail to online. It's probably put on steroids, that trend, which would have taken 3, 4, 5, 6 years to accomplish. Perhaps in 9 months or so, we've seen online really now take the lead in terms of overall spend going forward. But overall, when you look at the US consumer, there is an improvement in the way they are spending, discretionary spending, particularly when it comes to the services industries, the food industries. It's an interesting chart to show you that American consumers are spending big time on pizza. Well, that's because pizza delivery companies put in very, very fast online and virtual offerings and home delivery services, but those casual dining in-house restaurants, those are the ones much slower as a result of the second wave and the ongoing restrictions that occur in many states within the United States. It's also important to understand we're looking at the US economy, and I like to talk about the US economy partially because it has such an important bearing on the global economy. 10 years ago we were talking about the US economy falling into sort of a secondary position, not having the same dramatic effect on the rest of the world. Look, it still does. And it is important to look to see how the US consumer is spending their money. As it happens, the US consumer has been spending not too shabbily, but perhaps because they've been given rescue packages by the government. Once those rescue packages end, and you are seeing those rescue packages end in other parts of the world as well, that level of recovery, that initial part of the V, begins to taper off and becomes a lot more sort of flat-lined as we go forward. So I do think that we've gone through that initial recovery. We are now likely to see a slower rate of recovery, and that will affect the overall global environment as well. But you look at the charts, as I do all the time, and by now, doing this presentation, you know that I like charts. You can see that there's already an uptick in business confidence. Global manufacturing is beginning to rise again, and I do think the worst is essentially over. The world still has to face the theatrics of a United States presidential election. This is the world's election, the United States. We all love to talk about this particular issue, and certainly when it comes to the Trump-Biden contest, there's plenty of theater still ahead of us until that first week in November. The polls are tight, I must tell you. It looks to me as though it's going to be down to the wire. But in those key swing states which Biden ultimately has to win, he retains more or less a lead, but the lead is narrowing as issues about security become more important in the discourse, safety and security in the political discourse in the United States going forward. For all of us across the world, though, one issue that we are all going to have to face is how we pay for COVID over perhaps the next decade or so. Governments are racking up huge amounts of debt everywhere, not just South Africa. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I just want to set the global scene, because some of these global trends apply just as much as they do in South Africa as they do outside of South Africa. And with this burden of cost of managing COVID, providing these rescue checks for individuals, boosting the GDP of countries so affected by COVID, we are likely to see the world in a high level of debt for years to come. And this obviously can impact the ability of governments to spend. It can also impact tax rates in many parts of the world as well. And ultimately, I don't think that we really quite understand the effects of this long-term debt on all of us. It's not my generation ultimately that will pay for it. Well, I will in part when I pay my taxes, but the younger generation is going to be saddled with a degree of debt going forward for some time to come. Now, no one has escaped this pandemic. I've mentioned that your industry, of course, has been first in and probably last out in terms of the regulatory burden, and times have indeed been tough for the travel and leisure business travel sector as well. Ultimately, the data that I have seen suggests that the virus has cut international travel, international tourism in half, more than half, overall minus 56% on the world figure, and just about every continent or region of the world has been affected by this. And of course, you are still affected because there is still a very high degree of border closure as I speak here. There is some tweaking of borders, certainly across the African continent, where there's been a relatively low incidence of COVID, and we are starting to see Kenya, Tanzania, Namibia look as though they are starting to open their borders to international flights in particular. But if you look at the map, you can just see how behind the world still is in terms of opening up those borders. So there is a lag, there is a regulatory lag that still will affect us all. Global seat capacity, of course, also, which was nice and robust, more or less prior to the pandemic, now looks like, sort of a rather dangerous roller coaster, I must tell you. It's recovered from its lows, but seat capacity itself is also looking rather sort of anemic, even towards this last part of the year, as second waves and the restructuring of many airlines' business limit the amount of capacity on offer to passengers going forward. What's interesting, of course, in China is that we've seen domestic travel really be the spur to growth for obvious reasons, and that seat capacity, the availability of seats on the Chinese domestic routes, more or less look as though they're back to normal, although yields are likely to be somewhat lower. So there is certainly light at the end of the tunnel if you look to see the Chinese example going forward. The big saving grace for many airlines across the world who've been able to capitalize on this has been a rise in the air cargo component of their particular business. And certainly when passenger numbers are down, if you can make it up on air cargo, or at least in part on air cargo, you can put your capacity to some use going forward. It's true, as was said absolutely in the introduction, that consumers, as a result of COVID, are changing their perception about travel. There is an emergence of a low-touch economy, broadly speaking. And this research from Black Box, just completed in the last 2 months or so, clearly indicates that countries that offer more contactless experiences are the ones that, at least initially, as we get used to international travel again, they will be the winners going forward. And for businesses like yours, the same survey indicates that the use of contactless aspects of travel, e-boarding passes, for example, touchless lavatories in aircraft as well, all of these features could become part of this cliched new normal that applies to my regular life and applies to your traveling life and your business as well. I've seen fantastic examples of new airline seats, I might add, and it makes me happy, I must tell you. I can't stand people coughing behind me, even at the best of times, so I'll be quite happy when I see some of these perspex or glass or features added onto airline seats. Now, the big international trends are still very much with us. Some of those trends that were there prior to COVID haven't really changed. This sort of economic, military, hegemonic rivalry between the United States and China looks set to continue. And COVID actually has exacerbated that. Of course, there's a blame game as to the origins of the virus as well. But while I'm talking to you about the origins of the virus, I mean, one of my most telling images, and I showed you those images of social distancing at the beginning of this talk, but here's the epicenter of COVID-19, Wuhan in China. And that's a picture taken about a month ago at a big summer beach party in Wuhan. Wow, how things have changed over the course of 9 months, from a city in absolute lockdown to a city now returning to relative normality. So it can be done without a doubt. And again, it's indicative of the improvements also within the Chinese economy, one of the few economies set to rebound relatively quickly from COVID as well. We've just had in the last week Chinese industrial output and retail sales data, and both of them showing relatively healthy signs of improvement going forward. Now, this is important for South Africa because China, of course, is our biggest single trading partner as a country. The EU is bigger than China, but the EU is a collection of countries. And it is important, certainly for Africa as well, that the Chinese economy resumes its growth path, because China is a net importer in many cases of commodities, raw materials from the African continent, from us in South Africa, and a growing Chinese economy is extremely important for us. And it does look as though that economy is, again, there's a brand new, I happen to like retail, by the way. If I had another life, I might be in the airline business, but I also like retail. I'm not quite sure which one is the better one to go for. Both are troublesome businesses, I'll just tell you sometimes. But there you go. That's the new Costco store in Shanghai, opened just a month ago. Well, those shoppers look like they're pretty enjoying shopping up a storm, and there are not that many masks on display as well in Shanghai. So when you look at the world trends, and I do like to look at world trends, even from a South African perspective, we must understand that the trend that was there before COVID-19, the trend where Asia in particular the trend that Asia would be a growing economic powerhouse in the world and would have an increase in share of global GDP, that hasn't necessarily changed at all. And in fact, the more rapid recovery of many of these Asian economies are likely to boost Asia and perhaps also help Africa, that has over the last decade become much more integrated with China as well. I think one of the big sort of social threats that all of us face, whether we're talking in the United States, in the UK, or in South Africa for that matter, is what COVID does to inequality in society. We've all spoken a lot about inequality and how to combat it, and for much of the world we've made great gains in decreasing poverty levels and helping a new middle class to rise up. But the danger of COVID really is that those who can withstand the pandemic, those who can work from home, those with accessibility to communication and the internet, those in particular industries that are not affected by COVID, they may be on the upper slope of the K here. It's a K recovery for them. But those who are in the service industries, who don't have access to online, they are the ones who are likely to fall behind into the lower slope of the K. So very possibly, for all this talk about a V recovery and a W recovery and a swoosh for that matter, it may well be that from a social and humanitarian point of view, we are looking more at a K recovery. And this is critical really for both Africa and for South Africa, is how do you then manage to close the jaws, that gap between these two sides of the K recovery itself. Now, while I'm talking about Africa, and I do happen to like this continent, because when you look at Africa, firstly, those doomsayers about COVID on the African continent didn't quite get it right. The predictions of complete disaster for Africa simply haven't come to pass. And you can just see right at the bottom there of that chart, there's a pink line, but the next one is Africa there, and you can see that there have been relatively few cases of COVID-19 across the continent. And you strip out South Africa for that matter, and perhaps Egypt, you really get a very limited exposure to COVID across the continent. That's good news for Africa going forward. But it doesn't mean to say that it hasn't affected the GDP performance of many African countries. And for many who were the hotshot economies, Ethiopia, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, all of them are going to see GDP contractions, but they will still have positive GDP for this year. It'll just be, of course, substantially less than what was expected. The big losers, of course, on the African continent remain those big oil exporters, Nigeria, Angola for that matter, suffering as a decline of the oil price combined with COVID's effects, and South Africa as well. There was a weak foundation, a weak underbelly in South Africa, and COVID really has exacerbated many of those existing weaknesses. And there's a lot of research has been done also on the sort of the wealth of Africans, the per capita growth of Africans, and when we measure GDP per capita, and again, you've got to drill down into those individual little figures, in each country, there is a weakening of wealth across the African continent, which will exacerbate issues surrounding poverty levels, and also perhaps also, I think, slow some foreign direct investment coming into the continent. So the global effects of COVID, although not felt in any dramatic way in terms of healthcare services on the African continent, will have an economic impact of slowing Africa's growth. But there are some basic fundamentals about Africa that you can't get away from. I see them as positives. They have to be managed well, I must tell you, but I see them as positives. The growth of Africa's cities and population growth remains a key feature of this continent. And I tell you, while some in New York and some in San Francisco are looking at moving out of that urban jungle because of the effects of COVID, that's not going to be the case in Kinshasa or in Lagos for that matter, where that shift from rural to urban is likely to continue and continue apace. So the rise of the African city is going to be a key feature of this continent going forward, and that urbanization rise certainly will apply to South Africa as well. Look, this is a continent of great demographic explosion. By 2100, Africa is likely to be just about as populous as Asia. So the consumer of the future, the worker of the future, the urban conurbation of the future largely exists on this particular continent. Opportunities, yes, but clearly the management has to equal the great opportunities that do exist. So some of these global trends absolutely will affect the big global picture, the African picture. Many of them are going to affect us in South Africa as well. The South African story, I think, has been particularly interesting, and it's unfolding really as we speak. It's always difficult to do a presentation when you're talking about South Africa in times of COVID, because I always think we're working in COVID time. Anything could have happened, frankly, while I've been speaking to you here this morning. But let me give you some highlights of where I think South Africa is at. Now, we are either suffering from a very stringent lockdown, or we are actually recovering from the wise decisions taken over the last 6-7 months or so. You can be the judge of that. My own personal view is that we've had a very stringent lockdown. Now, it's my own personal view, and it's a view, of course, because I'm giving the presentation so I can do this, which is supported by Oxford University, who has analyzed lockdowns across the world, and South Africa has been named as having one of the most rigid lockdowns. And we still have a curfew, in case some forget. We still have liquor restrictions and regulations, and we've just opened up the sale of tobacco with all of that controversy as well. So it has been tough on South Africans. Of course, government and other analysts can point to this particular chart, which indicates quite clearly that we have managed to battle and overcome, at least in this initial stage, the scourge of COVID in South Africa. I mean, yesterday, the case numbers were relatively low, just below 800 nationally for that matter. And South Africa, that was number 4 or number 5 in terms of daily COVID cases around the world, now out of the top 20, I might add. So I do think that there's been substantial improvement across the board. Our health services have not completely been overrun at all, as the doomsayers were predicting. And in a country like South Africa, where health and public health in particular is going to occupy a much more important part of our economic discourse into the future, this was almost a test run for implementing some sort of national healthcare insurance within the country. If we're able to manage a pandemic like COVID, where both the public and private sector healthcare providers worked together, it does provide a reasonably good, let us say, initial model for the implementation of national health care into the future. But I do think that this is an issue that requires a lot more study, and it requires a lot of regulatory freedom in order to unburden many of the potential problems and pitfalls that national healthcare insurance could negatively affect within South Africa. But listen, that's a topic for another discussion. You can just see, and that's the chart you want to see here on the screen, the drop in case studies, cases of COVID across South Africa. It's a chart we should really all be proud of. Now, that's the relative good news. There's always a yes, but, and I'm an analyst, so there's a yes, but to all of that. The bottom line is that we have seen a continued weakening of our economy that was weak to start off with. Look, when your foundation is weak, the last thing you need is a global pandemic. The last thing you need is 6 months of regulation that stifles your economy. You haven't got a solid foundation. You don't have a large war chest to distribute like you do in the United States or even in most of Western Europe or so. You have very limited resources to try and help South Africans affected by this. We were in already 2 quarters of negative economic growth prior to COVID. We are now into our 4th quarter of negative economic growth, and what a dismal 4th quarter it has been. Now, one can dwell on these figures. I always think, should one dwell on the figures? Shouldn't one dwell on the figures? There's no surprise to you or to anyone watching this that when you shut down your economy to the extent that we did, you have a year-on-year GDP decline of about 51%. Now, I'm using the figure because I want to be dramatic. 51% economic decline. It's dramatic, but it's not really 51%. 51% assumes that you have a same decline that we had for the last quarter over 4 quarters of the year. That's not going to happen. We are going to see an improvement in GDP growth as we come back into the level 2 and possibly even level 1 over the course of the next week or so, and that may well improve our GDP. So the minus 51%, don't get too carried away with that. What we have seen is a minus 17% figure for our economy when you look at year on year, and we compare quarter 2 now to quarter 2 last year, minus 17%. Look, you can't smooth talk this. It's pretty grim, and it's going to affect us in many ways to come, and there'll be political and economic consequences for the government. Just again to show you quickly on this chart, I know it's a little bit small on the screen, but you'll just see there that when you look at that quarter-on-quarter comparison, there's South Africa in the sort of bottom third there, minus 17%. Italy did minus 18%, France did minus 18%, the UK minus 21%, and Peru, by the way, that had an incredibly strict lockdown, minus 30%. So, you can figure out whether these lockdowns have any great correlation with how economies performed as well. So what are our big challenges here? Well, clearly, the big challenge here is to at least begin to provide a safety net for South Africans, as we've done in the last 6 months or so by dishing out a fair amount of cash to South Africans to assist them, paying for COVID, paying for hospital care. The cost to our economy is enormous, and simply put, we've got to borrow. We were borrowing too much before COVID, but this has put the borrowing on steroids as well, as you can see. Now, if you don't control your spending and you keep on borrowing, you get that yellow line. You get that yellow line right there. If you begin to control your spending, you can ameliorate and soften the amount of borrowing that you will have to do. And that's really what we have to do. We cannot tolerate these very high levels of incurring debt. We have to soften the debt burden. Otherwise, it's not just the next generation. Well, the next generation will pay for COVID for years and years to come. And you look at some of these charts, you can just see the seriousness of the problem in South Africa. Here we have revenue spending, which is the dotted line. Look at it going sky high, government spending as a result of COVID. And you can just see here government spending, government revenue dropping quite dramatically. Well, for obvious reasons. Economy shut down, limited tax receipts over the course of the last 6 months. Sin taxes barely applicable in the last 6 months. Your revenue figures are going to be affected negatively. So you've got these jaws, the jaws here between government spending and government revenue, and you've got to close that somehow in the course of the next few years. Otherwise, you run into the possibility of a fiscal disaster, a fiscal nightmare where we default on our debt and we have to go to the international lending agencies cap in hand for a much bigger amount of borrowing than we have thus far. That's the danger. And if you don't get this right, the danger is you enter a kind of Argentina environment in which we lurch from one debt default to another debt default, and no one wants that. Certainly the political authorities don't want that, and all of us don't want that, because the implications for access to our capital and the implications for the value of our currency are quite distressing, to put it mildly. Our tax revenue, of course, has slumped, and slumped quite substantially, as that chart would indicate to you. And that's why, we have to now go to begin a regime of borrowing at least a tranche of money to try and tide us through this particular period. We've gone to the International Monetary Fund. It's significant that we've gone to the IMF, to the tune of about $4 billion, by the way, because the ANC never wanted to touch the IMF. The IMF was seen as part of the Washington consensus that the IMF would take away sovereignty about our own ability to manage our economic affairs. They'd set conditions for South Africa. Now, in times of COVID, where this money is regarded as COVID relief or emergency funds, the amount of headline conditions on South Africa is relatively limited. It's not as though we have to change the way we do business according to the IMF. And that's why it's been politically easier to sell this within the ANC alliance. The conditionalities are less restrictive and less onerous on us. But make no mistake, once you've got this kind of cash, even in limited form, you've got to spend this cash wisely, and you've got to protect this cash from the scourge of graft and corruption. Because if you don't, the next time you go to the IMF, which could very well be if we don't get our act in order in the next 2, 3, 4 years or so, then the conditions become that bit more onerous on South Africa. So managing this initial tranche of cash is critically important for us should we have to go back cap in hand to the IMF. And of course, we've set a precedence, in a sense, by going to the IMF. So, you could argue this is a weakness for South Africa. It takes away some of our ability to raise our own finance under our own rules. But I think in this time of distress, this is an opportunity to take the cash and to look at ways to kickstart the recovery that clearly all of us would like. There is a statistical recovery underway within South Africa at the moment. We've seen this measurement of economic transactions tick up from its lows, as you can see, and the tick up has been quite substantial, but again, well below the pre-COVID period or so. We've seen, I'll move a little bit there, business confidence. Our business confidence, look at that graph. I mean, business confidence is at a low, what is that, a 50-year low or so. It's ticked up just ever so slightly in the last week. We've just had the latest data. And that does show again that the opening up of the economy, the lessening of the restrictions beginning to have an effect on our ability to trade once again. But just like other parts of the world, we are looking at something of a sort of a swoosh, but it's a much softer swoosh recovery in South Africa. That V-shaped recovery hasn't really occurred yet. It's kind of soft little recovery, and then a very muted or elongated, extended recovery. Again, well below what there was before COVID, and that could extend for some years to come. Now, really, you need to kickstart this economy. That's the hard data. And if you're going to kickstart the economy, you've got to move beyond sort of ideological constraints. You've got to begin to take some tough measures going forward. There really is now a stark choice in South Africa. And I was asked yesterday by a journalist, do I think that government actually understand the moment that we're in? Do they get this sort of necessity to make the choices that they haven't been able to make in the past? My argument is actually yes. I think, the penny, to use a bad term, the penny has finally dropped. And COVID, again, has increased the speed of our need to in fact take these tough decisions, because the choices are pretty stark. There's a low road, which is fairly obvious, and there's a better road or a higher road. It applied many years ago when Clem Sunter did his marvelous projections. It applies just the same now. Bold action is required in South Africa. Otherwise, the social disaster of unemployment, which has been again put on steroids by COVID, is going to overtake us from a social and, of course, criminality point of view as well. So our recovery has to be a recovery that's meaningful and a recovery that takes us not only back to prior COVID, but takes us to a better point. And for that, we need substantial regulatory change within South Africa and a much more efficient focus on critical aspects of our economy going forward. It is a bit like a puzzle, as the graphic would suggest, and very often all these pieces don't necessarily fit together, especially when we've been buffeted by a health pandemic that was unforeseen only 9 months ago. But there are obviously some critical areas that need attention. And I haven't got time to delve into each one of these, but I'll just mention them in passing. It's nice to give big pictures, because to talk about the minutiae of detail can be very difficult. But you'll see in many of these issues, there's also a political and ideological bottleneck that has held us back. I mean, we really have to improve the energy supply and power grid within South Africa. I can show you all the graphs where we need to bounce back better and get to a better level, but you ain't going to do it with power blackouts or load shedding as a regular feature of our life. And you need to free up the regulatory environment in order to encourage both renewable energy and the ability of businesses to procure and produce their own independent energy supplies outside of the control of Eskom. So the role of the state becomes a critical factor. But we do need the state. We do need the state to assist in very big capital creation projects. And I think we're about to see from government the announcement of a very big rollout of an economic rescue package. It will include, I hope, a clearer vision for energy consumption in South Africa. But what I think it will include is an emphasis on infrastructural delivery in this country. If you're going to claw yourself back, you need better roads, you need better harbors, you need better ports, you need improved airports for that matter. Airports affected budgetary-wise, of course, as a result of COVID. But that infrastructure and improving that infrastructure in a globally competitive environment, critical to creating jobs and spurring on the economy going forward. You need a digitized economy. One could get very frustrated that the access to affordable internet in South Africa is still limited. And of course, we need to improve speeds, and we need to embrace that spectrum sale that can garner many, many millions, if not billions of rands for the South African government as well. You need better water management in this country, because we're a critically dry country with water shortage issues, and an improved water management system also will afford us an insurance policy for the future. And you also need to really reinvigorate our manufacturing within South Africa. If there's one area where we could have relatively quick wins, it is to get South Africans back to work in many of our factories that are underutilized at the moment. And there's a great opportunity right now, because global supply chains are more flexible than they've ever been. Companies are looking at perhaps not putting all their eggs in terms of manufacturing in the China basket. It's time to bring manufacturing home, not just for South Africans, but we've got millions of Africans on our doorstep in the SADC region, in the Central African region, who could buy products made in South Africa. So logistically, the positioning of Africa in this changing global supply chain becomes an opportunity as a result of COVID. For our domestic entrepreneurs, particularly young black entrepreneurs in South Africa, it is true that many have had great difficulty in accessing capital to start their business. And I do think that government can play a hand in terms of facilitating those lending mechanisms for young entrepreneurial South Africans. So you can get on with this, and you begin doing this, and you can be much more creative with your economy than you've been in the past. You can open up special economic zones with better and easier labor relations regimes, lower tax rates to incentivize businesses to invest. Let's get on with this going forward. Again, it's nice to give a list of all of this that we should do. There are those bottlenecks that I sometimes say if I had more hair on my head, I would pull out the remaining strands in frustration, because these are the issues that somehow we just don't get right. I mean, you've really got to improve the ease of doing business. You've got to improve your labor law position to make that hiring and firing that bit more flexible. Perhaps it's better to have more workers at slightly lower wage rates than have people unemployed and obviously falling into a greater poverty trap or dependency trap into the future. You've got to simplify regulations pertaining to the mining industry, to the energy industry as well. You've got to have clarity on policy, clarity on land reform. I mean, this lack of clarity on policy holds back both domestic and foreign investors. And I could go on and I could go on. So there's a political side to this equation. Yeah, we can show you all the good plans, infrastructure, all the rest of it, but the political side is a lot more difficult to accomplish. And you've got to cut your cloth, as the old saying goes. You can't spend so much on that government salary bill as you've done in the past. You can just see in terms of this chart that South Africa is one of the highest percentages of GDP paid in state wages or salaries on an annual basis, which means you've got to cut the amount of workers in your civil service, and you've got to also reduce those salary increases as well. Not very easy to accomplish politically. So from a sort of broad political perspective, the state has to tackle a couple of big picture issues now. The critical issue is honesty, credibility, ethics in government, and building a capable state. Now, if the state wants to be the leader in terms of this, if the state wants to set the regulatory environment, then the state has to be a trustworthy state. And I would certainly argue, and you can call it controversial, but we want to build a capable state, but I don't believe we have been a capable state in South Africa, perhaps for the last decade or so. And rebuilding that, taking out those who've enjoyed milking the system and replacing them with honest brokers who really are patriotic South Africans in the true sense of the word, not to their political party, but to the country. That's a very tough issue to accomplish in a relatively short space of time, but you've got to start somewhere. So I am more hopeful that there is certainly the rhetoric is correct from President Ramaphosa in terms of this. The question is, does he have the political will and political strength to be able to hold those who have been accused of nefarious activities to account? And can, in fact, some of those very senior members of the ANC who are allegedly involved in transgressions, will they indeed face prosecution, or will they simply continue to believe that impunity is the order of the day in South Africa? Now, I'm waiting to see some big names being prosecuted. And I hope, as I speak to you this morning, that I live long enough to see that, because there's a clear litmus test here of holding those to account within South Africa. We all believe that there will be a series of prosecutions in the coming months or so, and we've seen the ANC deeply hurt and affected by corruption, in particular COVID-related corruption, just in the last few months or so. In all my years as a political analyst, I've never seen such an outpouring of criticism towards the ANC. I think COVID itself has raised our consciousness. The abuse of humanitarian funds in particular has raised the shackles of so many South Africans, even those who have historically supported the ANC. So the brand of the ANC has certainly been damaged just in the last few months, and local government elections are not far away. By mid-next year, government is tense. It has to be seen to be finally acting, and the president clearly needs to find his inner strength to have the courage now of his convictions to take necessary action. Just in the last few weeks, we've seen the president write a very dramatic letter to his own political party, effectively reading them the riot act on corruption and on the effects of corruption on the public morale and support for the ANC. I think it was a very significant letter, I must tell you. But, and there's always a but, the question remains, will he act? Will he allow his prosecuting agencies to act with sufficient strength, even if that means creating additional tension within the ANC itself? So the corruption issue is certainly a focus within the ANC at the moment. And I tell you, I don't think President Ramaphosa has an open-ended amount of time to get this right. I actually do believe that the window of opportunity for him is closing. We need to see prosecutions by the end of the year. This can't just continue into the holiday season and then into late January or into February. I think question marks will be asked about the strength of the president to lead. So Ramaphosa is under substantial pressure to get this right. If he leads, I think he'll be rewarded. If he sits on his hands on this issue, he will face the accusations of being weak and will face also the wrath of voters in those local government elections next year. So the corruption issue is one issue. The other issue is the ANC's inability to really find consensus on policy going forward. There's populists, there are quasi-capitalists, there's socialists, there are communists, the trade unionists. Those factions are still at loggerheads with one another within the ANC. And that's why I'm waiting now for this economic rescue package to be announced by government. It is imminent in the next few weeks. And I hope that that will give us some clarity as to which sides of that ideological battle are beginning to win out. If we are to succeed in this post-COVID environment, we need to rebuild relationships within South Africa between perhaps different racial, ethnic groups. But in terms of economic relationships, the state has to improve its relationship with the private sector. The state is not going to be able to rebuild without some form of re-embrace of the private sector going forward. And again, the Economic Development and Rescue document hopefully will outline aspects of the private sector's involvement in rebuilding our economy, because to me, that is absolutely critical. So, when you look at South Africa today, you get the feeling that there is a crossroads for us once again. Look, I've lived here all my life. Man, oh man, every few years there's a crossroads. I almost can repeat some of these phrases on an annual basis. But clearly, there is a sort of a virtuous circle, as I've tried to show you on the screen here. We need traction in better governance. Traction in better governance. We need transparency in governance as well, and that builds trust for all of us. That's a long and arduous process, and I'm afraid the rotten damage within the ANC extends the longevity of this very tough process going forward. But I do think that we have the skills to plan a better South Africa. Our bottleneck has been in implementation, and the constraints to implement have been based upon political constraints and perhaps also a skills deficiency within the state to drive the necessary change going forward. But having said all of that, and as you can hear, I'm cautious about whether we will have that wherewithal to weather the storm and to build back better. My own view is that there is the beginnings of a very serious review of where we are at in South Africa. And from the ANC's perspective, this means that some political risk-taking is going to have to take place. That creates some more work for a political analyst like myself, who likes a degree of political risk built in. But for the ANC, this is going to be the toughest of times for them. They face a very serious possible reduction in support in local government elections next year. Ramaphosa has to begin a process of rebuilding, a process of trust, and a process of hope in the future. If he doesn't, the ANC will suffer at the polls, and Ramaphosa's leadership and his position in the ANC will also suffer. So it's not just about the economy, it's not just about the graphs, it's also about the survival of the ANC in power, and the survival, for that matter, of President Ramaphosa as President of South Africa. And when political parties are put under that type of pressure, they either splinter or split, or they actually begin to roll up their sleeves and tackle the position. And that's what I hope we will be in by perhaps mid of next year or so. Now, I hope that I've given you some food for thought. Long presentation, a lot of slides. I'm happy to give those to you if you'd like in a PDF format. And I know that we'll take a short break right now, and hopefully there'll be some questions that I can answer after the break. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey, a Delta Redcoat. I know it's probably been a little while since you've been on a plane, but don't worry. I'll be walking you through all the steps that Delta's implementing to keep you safe while on board and at the airport. We call it Delta Care Standard. Delta Care Standard means you'll experience safer travels in 3 layers when you fly with us now. 1. The highest standards of cleanliness. 2. More space. And 3. Safer service. These layers are important because there is no single solution. We're consulting closely with medical experts to develop Delta Care Standard. And we go beyond what's required to make sure we provide you the safest travel experience possible. At every step of your journey, you'll see Delta Care Standard in place. Every flight, every day, everywhere. A day or 2 before your flight, you'll receive an email from Delta with the latest information on what to expect, a checklist outlining how to prepare for your trip, and a link to an infographic detailing all the measures we put in place for your care. We also recommend downloading the Fly Delta app, where you can get your digital boarding pass to reduce touch points at the airport and receive important notifications throughout your trip. First off, remember your mask. They are required to be worn at the airport and on board the aircraft. Upon arriving at the airport, if you have to check a bag, we've placed floor decals throughout the waiting area so you can distance yourself from other passengers while in line. We've installed plexiglass barriers at all counters, and we're cleaning kiosks and surfaces throughout the day at check-in, Delta Sky Clubs, and gate areas. You'll also find hand sanitizing stations placed conveniently throughout the airport. These added layers of protection provide a consistently safer experience throughout your journey. When you get to security, you'll find TSA officers are now required to wear masks and gloves. They'll also ask you to scan your own boarding pass. If you are a Clear member, you can verify your identity using your eyes, enabling a touchless verification experience at security. You can head to tsa.gov to find the latest information on any changes happening. Some changes, like being able to bring more hand sanitizer, are a plus. Some of our clubs remain open. We have consolidated clubs, discontinued shower service, and we've switched from a buffet-style food option to a pre-packaged food option. At Delta Sky Club and our gate areas, you'll find additional measures of cleanliness, more space, and safer service methods in place. We're implementing one of the most important cleanliness factors you can't see. We're using an electrostatic sprayer to sanitize the aircraft. We spray and sanitize all surfaces, including overhead bins and lavatories thoroughly before every single flight. Don't worry, it's immediately safe to breathe afterwards. Every night, we spray and sanitize the jet bridge and gate areas, and we're expanding it to catering and baggage claim. Our teams wipe down and sanitize high-touch surfaces and lavatories. The Delta difference means we are committed to these cleaning measures now and always. Flight attendants and gate agents walk the cabin to spot check. And if it doesn't meet Delta's new standard for cleanliness, we are empowered to call the cleaners back onto the aircraft. Before you board, the Fly Delta app notifies you when the extensive cleaning of your aircraft is complete. As you board the aircraft, you'll find that we are boarding in smaller groups. We'll start at the rear of the aircraft and move forward to reduce contact in the aisle. At Delta, we're committed to giving you more personal space on board, reducing cabin capacity to 50% in first class and 60% in main cabin. Families will be able to sit together on board if they choose to. You'll be offered a snack bag, including a bottle of water, snacks, and a hand sanitizing wipe or gel pack. It's part of our overall effort to deliver service safely. As you settle in your seat, please let your flight attendant know if you have any concerns. We still offer world-class entertainment, so you can relax, plug in, and tune out. And you can stay connected with Wi-Fi access and free messaging. We understand that cabin air quality is critical to feeling safe. The air on all of our aircraft is completely refreshed 10 to 30 times per hour. Air flows into the cabin from above each seat and is pulled out at floor level. This helps limit person-to-person airflow. Air is then refreshed with outside air and air that's been filtered through high-grade HEPA filters, which function in a similar way to filtration systems used in hospitals. These filters remove 99.99% of particles, including viruses. To be extra safe, we replace filters twice as often as recommended. Once you arrive at your destination, remember to allow some extra space while deplaning front to back. Again, in smaller groups to reduce contact in the aisles. When you pick up your bag, you'll notice distancing markers and sanitizing stations throughout baggage claim, so you can stay safe even as you depart the airport. With all these added layers of protection, Delta is committed to a safer experience for your family and for ours, because without health and safety, we have nothing. But we're not stopping there. We're constantly updating best practices and improving our new standard of care based on expert medical advice. We hope to see you back on board very soon. Until then, safe travels.
Well, I think I probably exhausted you with that presentation. I haven't had any questions. I could ask my own questions, but I'm not going to ask my own questions. I do want to say that I said to you in the presentation that we are living in COVID time where things happen. I know that it now, as a result of news reports while I've been speaking to you, it does look as though there will be a restricted and limited opening of international borders announced perhaps tonight or in the next few days or so by the president. It does look as though we will move to level 1 in South Africa. And it does look as though it's going to be a fairly slow resumption from a travel point of view and from a flight point of view, with, from what press reports say, will be fairly strict or onerous visa requirements for those coming into South Africa. But at least I think it allows some planning in terms of the travel, tourism, even MICE industries to take forward in the next few months or so. And that, I think, is at least relatively good news for the next few months. So, for all of you at Delta, I think it will, begin to move us into, hopefully, the beginnings of the resumption of services that I'm really chomping at the bit to take from Cape Town to Atlanta and elsewhere. So everybody, I really must thank you very much. Finally, just a final point. I know there are a lot of charts in the presentation. If any of you want some of those charts, you can get hold of Delta, or you can come to me, and I'll send you a PDF version of the presentation for your bedtime reading. But I'm sure there's a lot more pleasant bedtime reading that you can do. So it just gives me to thank everybody again for inviting me to do this webinar. Watch the space on all of these issues. There are going to be shifts of great magnitude on probably each one of the slides and charts that I've given. But I do think that hopefully the worst is over for all of us. Hopefully we can resume some normalcy now into the next number of months and work towards a revival, whether it's a revival of the travel and leisure industry, or whether, from my point of view, certainly as a South African, a revival of South Africa. Thanks very much and have a very good day.
Like we have answered all your questions. Before I close, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Daniel for sharing his insight with us, and I'd like to thank you for attending and your participation. Finally, I'd like to extend a huge thank you to the Century City Virtual Conference team, who are based in Century City, Cape Town, for hosting this platform and the sterling job that they have done today. To end the session, we will be closing with a short 2-minute video. Thank you for joining us today, and look forward to welcoming you on board a Delta Airlines flight soon.
Dr. Sag, many of our customers want to learn more about the air quality on board an aircraft. A recent article in the Washington Post stated that being on board an aircraft is no less safe than other places. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Well, the details matter. If the passengers are spaced apart, they're wearing masks, then it is very safe on an airplane. The air is refreshed frequently, taken off the plane 10 to 30 times an hour. It goes through a filter and the infectious organisms are removed. It's then mixed with fresh air and put back onto the plane. Compare that to what happens in a hospital room for someone with, say, tuberculosis. There, the air exchange is only 6 to 8 times an hour, so many more air exchanges on an airplane than even in a hospital room with somebody with tuberculosis.
Wow, interesting. And I know as a flight attendant, we typically turn on those vents overhead, and that filtered air does go down and then out. So there's not a lot of circulation from the front of the plane to the back of the plane.
That's right.
That probably helps as well.
It does. So all things together help make the experience safe.
I know you and I walked through an aircraft earlier and discussed some of this, but you actually flew here from Birmingham this morning on a Delta flight. How was your experience?
Well, it was interesting because there were some new changes, especially coming on the plane. I was given wipes. I could wipe down the seat around me. I had water and I had snacks that were given to me on the plane with some hand wipes. But the thing that impressed me most was the spacing of passengers. Nobody was sitting right next to somebody else. My son, who's a physician in New York, recently flew back to my hometown on another airline, and they were packed in like sardines. And so keeping that distance, making sure that passengers are not right on top of one another is very important.
Dr. Sag, thank you so much for your time. Fantastic advice.
My pleasure.